I was sitting at a coffee shop this morning.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and I was looking out the window, and I saw a delivery truck drop off a package across the street. And then I checked my phone, read a headline from Europe, ordered a replacement part for my dishwasher that's probably coming from Asia somewhere,
Sure.
and I paid for my coffee with the tap of my watch. And it all just felt so normal. We just assumed this friction-free existence,
Yeah.
where you can get anything from anywhere in 2 days, is just how the world works.
It is definitely the default setting for us. But, I mean, if you take a step back and look at the grand sweep of human history, what we've experienced for the last 75 years isn't normal at all. It's really a complete anomaly.
A blip.
A blip that we've basically built our entire lives around.
Exactly.
And that is exactly what we are unpacking today. We're doing a deep dive into Peter Zeihan's book, The End of the World is Just the Beginning.
That's quite the title. It is a jarring title. But I want to be clear right up front for everyone listening. This isn't a book about zombies or asteroid strikes. We're looking at maps, we're looking at birth rates, and we're exploring why the globalized world we love is effectively running on fumes.
Yeah, Zeihan isn't trying to just scare people for the sake of it. He's a geopolitical strategist. So he looks at hard-dated geography and demographics primarily.
Right.
And his core argument is that this era of cheap, better, and faster was an artificial construct. The global order that allowed all this globalization to happen is collapsing. And we are reverting to a historical mean that is going to be much more fragmented, much more expensive, and honestly, more dangerous.
So the mission for this deep dive is to understand why the party is over. We need to unpack Zeihan's argument that the U.S. is checking out, that the world is literally running out of people, and that geography, which we kind of thought technology had conquered, is back with a vengeance.
Absolutely. And to understand the collapse, you really have to understand the foundation. Zeihan argues that the world we know started in 1945 with the Bretton Woods system.
Which usually sounds like a really boring economics lecture.
Right. You hear Bretton Woods and you think currency pegs and gold standards, but Zeihan frames it entirely as a security arrangement. He calls it a strategic bribe.
I love this framing because it completely flips the narrative. We usually think the U.S. created global trade just to get rich.
Exactly. But Zeihan says the U.S. created global trade to fight the Soviets. Picture the world in 1945. Europe is rubble. The Japanese Empire is destroyed. The U.S. is the only industrial power left standing, but they have this massive new problem in the Soviet Union.
The Red Army is massive at this point.
Huge. So the Americans needed a global alliance to contain them. But how do you get countries that have been killing each other for centuries? The French and the Germans, the Japanese and their neighbors, how do you get them to join the same team?
You offer them a deal they can't refuse.
You change the rules of the entire game. Before 1945, if you wanted resources, oil, iron, grain, you had to own the land, or you had to have a navy big enough to go take it. That was the imperial model.
Right, you had to protect your own stuff.
But the U.S. said, forget that. We have the only navy that matters now. We will patrol the global oceans. We will guarantee that any ship can go anywhere safely. You can access any market, any raw material you need without an army. You just have to side with us against the Soviets.
That's the bribe. We provide the security, you provide the alliance. And the side effect of that military strategy was globalization.
Precisely. Suddenly, you didn't need to be a military power to be an economic power. You could be a tiny island nation with zero natural resources and still become an economic giant because the U.S. Navy was guarding your shipping lanes for free.
It allowed economies to flourish in totally geographically poor locations. But here is the kicker and the core of Zeihan's argument. The Cold War ended 30 years ago.
The Soviet Union is gone. The strategic reason for that bribe has completely evaporated.
And usually people argue that the U.S. stays involved everywhere because of oil, like we have to protect the Middle East to keep gas prices down. But Zeihan points to the shale revolution as the final nail in the coffin for the old order.
This is a huge factor in his analysis. The shale revolution didn't just lower gas prices, it fundamentally changed U.S. geopolitics. The U.S. is now the world's largest oil and gas producer. It's energy independent.
Which
means the U.S. no longer needs to patrol the Persian Gulf to keep the lights on in Chicago. The strategic imperative to police the world's shipping lanes is gone.
So the U.S. is basically taking its ball and going home. Zeihan describes this transition from the U.S. being the guarantor of global order to becoming a potential agent of disorder.
It's a profound shift, and he stresses that without the global policeman, that artificial safety that allowed globalization to exist just disappears. But that's only one pincer of the collapse. The other one is much more personal.
It's about people, or rather, the fact that we stopped making them.
Exactly. The demographic inversion.
This part of the book is terrifying to read, because it feels like a math problem with no solution. We always hear about overpopulation from the media, but Zeihan argues the real crisis is that we ran out of kids 40 years ago.
It all comes down to the shift from the farm to the city. Think about it. On a farm, children are free labor.
Right, they're an economic asset.
You have 6 kids because that's 6 more workers for the harvest. But when you move to the city to work in a factory or an office, kids flip from being an asset to a massive liability.
He calls them expensive hobbies.
Expensive hobbies, yeah.
Nah.
They need space, they need iPads, they need college tuition, they don't generate any income for the household.
So as the world industrialized and urbanized, birth rates plummeted. And now, fast forward to the 2020s, we are hitting the wall.
We're absolutely hitting it. The boomer generation, which is the largest generation in history, is retiring en masse right now. And this is a double whammy for the global economy.
Because they're leaving the workforce.
First, yes, you lose your most skilled, experienced workers, but second, you lose their capital. Boomers are moving their money out of high-growth investments like stocks and into safe, boring bonds for retirement.
All because they can't afford risk anymore.
Right, so at the exact same moment, labor gets scarce and capital gets expensive. There aren't enough young people in Generation X or the Zoomer cohort to replace them.
And Zeman points out some specific countries that are basically terminal cases. Now, we're not taking any political sides here, just reporting what the book says, but his data on China really stood out to me.
It's staggering. We're so used to hearing about the unstoppable rise of China, but Zeihan calls them the fastest aging society in human history.
Because of the one-child policy?
That's a big part of it. The one-child policy took that natural urbanization drop we just talked about and forced it off a cliff. China managed to squeeze 200 years of economic development into 40 years, but they also squeezed the demographic transition into that same window.
So they're getting old before they get rich.
That is the trap. Labor costs in China have already risen by a factor of 15 over the last couple of decades. They simply aren't the cheap workshop of the world anymore.
Wow. 15 times.
Yeah. And because they have this inverted population pyramid, way more retirees at the top than workers at the bottom, they are physically running out of the people needed to maintain their system.
And he puts Germany and Russia in that same boat, right? Facing terminal demographic declines.
Yeah.
Running out of skilled labor to keep their factories running.
Correct. But he argues there's one massive exception to this rule.
The United States.
Yes. The U.S. is the only developed nation with a healthy demographic profile, and it's largely thanks to the millennials.
Which is funny because people love to complain about millennials.
Oh, he jokes about that too, saying they have their faults. But numerically, they are a huge generation. Their very existence means the U.S. has a replacement workforce and a consumption base that places like China and Germany simply don't have. Other exceptions, he notes, are France, Argentina, and New Zealand, but the U.S. is the heavyweight.
So we have the U.S. pulling back its security umbrella and the rest of the world running out of people. But Zeihan doubles down on why North America is poised to win this new era. And it's not just the people, it's the dirt. It's the map itself.
Geography is destiny. Zeihan is obsessed with river networks, and for a very good reason.
He throws out this stat that really contextualizes it. Transporting goods by water costs about 1/12 of what it costs to move them by land.
1/12.
That's the difference between a profitable business and bankruptcy right there.
It is huge. And the U.S. has the greater Mississippi Basin. It has more navigable internal waterways than the rest of the world combined. Combined, that creates a massive internal capital generation engine. You can move crops from the Midwest down the Mississippi to global markets for absolute pennies.
And he contrasts that with Europe and Asia.
Right, compare that to Germany. Germany sits on the North European plain. It's flat, it's open, it's incredibly easy to invade. Or look at China. The Yellow River is full of silt and mostly unnavigable for large ships, and the Yangtze River separates the country rather than unifying it.
And Zeihan calls the U.S. geography Goldilocks. It's just right. You've got the rivers of transport. You've got the Midwest, which he points out has the world's largest contiguous overlap of high-quality soil and temperate climate. So food is secure.
And energy is secure. Like we mentioned earlier, the U.S. is energy independent. Think about the vulnerability elsewhere. China imports 70% of its oil. Japan imports almost everything.
So if global trade stops, the U.S. lights stay on.
Exactly. In China, the lights literally go out. Plus, from a security standpoint, you can't invade the U.S. You've got oceans on the east and west,
Yes.
deserts to the south, forests and lakes to the north. It's an absolute fortress.
Okay, let's go back to that idea you just mentioned, if global trade stops. Because this is where the book gets really cinematic for me. Zeihan talks about the security of the seas and the return of privateers. It sounds like something out of the 1700s.
I know it sounds totally archaic, but it's a very logical progression when you look at the incentives. If the U.S. Navy stops patrolling the shipping lanes, say, from the Persian Gulf to East Asia, who keeps them safe?
Nobody.
Right. No other country has a blue water navy capable of projecting power globally, so those long-haul trade routes become incredibly risky.
So if I'm a business shipping a container from Shanghai to Hamburg, suddenly I have to worry about someone literally just taking it.
You have to worry about state-backed piracy,
Right.
or privateering, to use the historical term, countries using their navies to seize or tax merchant ships to secure resources for themselves. Zeihan has this great, terrifying quote in the book: "If it's in a ship, it's worth taking."
That is terrifying. But surely insurance covers this kind of thing, like businesses insure their cargo.
That's the weak link. That's exactly how the system breaks. Commercial shipping runs on insurance. If piracy becomes common, or if ships start getting seized in choke points like the Strait of Malacca or the Persian Gulf, insurance rates are going to spike.
Oh, and if you can't insure the cargo, or if the premium is higher than your profit margin, you just don't ship it.
The cargo doesn't move. And that completely breaks the whole just-in-time supply chain model we relied on. If you can't guarantee the parts will arrive on Tuesday, you can't run the factory on Wednesday.
It shatters it, which leads us to the next big consequence he outlines, the de-industrialization wave. And he uses a really simple example to explain this, a wooden top.
Yeah, a child's spinning toy. It's just wood, glue, and paint.
Right, but in our globalized world, the wood comes from one continent, the glue is a specialized chemical from another, the paint comes from a third.
And if you break just one link in that chain, if the ship carrying the specialized glue gets seized or can't get insurance, you can't make the top. The factory stops.
Now apply that to a modern car with 30,000 parts. Or a smartphone.
Exactly. Zeihan argues that specialized manufacturing clusters like the ones in Germany or China are doomed because they rely entirely on importing raw materials from far away and exporting finished goods to distant markets.
And he paints a really bleak picture for Germany specifically here.
Yeah.
He talks about a mini Europe fragmentation.
Because Germany needs Russian energy to power its factories, which, as we've seen recently, is already a massive crisis point, and it needs global markets to sell its high-end machinery. Without the U.S. guaranteeing access to those markets, and with the energy inputs disappearing, Germany deindustrializes. They simply can't function as the heavy manufacturing hub they are today.
And what about China's manufacturing base?
Zeihan says China faces a mythic scale of deindustrialization. Without imported energy, without imported food, and without the U.S. market to buy all their stuff, the system collapses. It's a return to simpler, localized economies.
So the new rule becomes if you can't make it locally or get it from a neighbor you can easily drive to, you just won't have it.
You won't have it. The era of getting everything from everywhere is over.
So if global is out and local is in, what does the map of the future actually look like? Zeihan talks about the future frontiers. And once again, it sounds like North America wins the lottery.
He calls it the NAFTA fortress. North America, meaning the U.S., Canada, and Mexico, is the most self-sufficient region on the planet.
How does that breakdown work?
You have U.S. capital, technology, and a massive consumer base. You have Canadian resources and energy. And crucially, you have Mexican labor.
Mexico's a really interesting part of this analysis. Because Zeihan essentially says Mexico replaces China for the U.S.
For the U.S. market, yes, absolutely. Mexico has a much younger demographic profile than China. It's physically connected to the U.S., so you don't have to worry about ocean transport risks or those insurance spikes we talked about.
You just put it on a truck or a train and drive it north?
Exactly. Moving manufacturing from China to Mexico isn't just a cost decision anymore. Zeihan argues it's a survival decision for resilience.
So we end up with a split world. The West, which is basically this NAFTA fortress plus parts of South America, Australia, and maybe allies like the UK and Japan if they align with the US. And then there's the rest.
And the rest is where the story gets very dark. Zeihan predicts a scramble for resources and specifically famine on a massive scale.
Famine, just from supply chains breaking.
Because of the inputs, modern agriculture is basically a mechanism that turns fossil fuel energy into food. Natural gas is used to make nitrogen fertilizer. Potash and phosphate are mined in very specific places like Russia and Morocco.
And if those global trade routes break down,
If you are in a region that depends on imported food and imported fertilizer, like parts of Africa, the Middle East, and frankly China, and you can't get those inputs safely, your crop yields collapse.
wow.
He throws around numbers like 1 billion people at risk of starvation.
hmm
It is a horrifying calculus, but he insists it's just based on the physics of agriculture and the fragility of these long supply lines.
It's really heavy. It honestly forces you to completely reframe how you look at the news. When you see a supply chain snag now or a semiconductor shortage, you have to think, is this just a glitch or is this the start of the breakdown he's talking about?
And that's exactly the shift in mindset Zeihan is pushing for. We are moving from an era of efficiency where you make things wherever it is absolutely cheapest on the planet to an era of resilience where you make things wherever it is safest and closest to home.
Before we wrap up, I want to touch on the role of the U.S. in this new world.
Yeah.
Because usually in these geopolitical thrillers, the U.S. is the savior that swoops in to fix everything. But Zion suggests the U.S. will survive and thrive, but not as the good guy.
Right. He sees the U.S. becoming what he calls an agent of disorder. Because the U.S. is insulated, it's food secure, energy secure, geographically isolated, it doesn't need to fix the world's problems to survive.
It can just sit behind its fortress walls.
Exactly. So instead of patrolling the seas to help everyone, the U.S. might use its power to block rivals, enforce sanctions, or just protect its own specific interests while letting the rest of the world burn.
That is a jarring forecast. It totally challenges this idea that we're all in this together globally. Zeihan is basically saying we were in it together because the U.S. paid for it. Now the check is due, and the U.S. is just leaving the table.
That's a great way to put it. And the listener is left with a very practical question to answer for themselves. Is my business, is my lifestyle resilient enough for a world where global trade stops being easy?
So what's the final word here? The book says the end of the world is just the beginning. What is it the beginning of?
It's the beginning of a return to history. The last 75 years were a vacation from history. Now we are back to the norm where geography determines destiny. If you have good geography, like the U.S., you survive. If you don't, you struggle. It's not the end of humanity, but it is the end of the world order we all grew up with.
Well, this deep dive definitely gives you a lot to process. And I want to leave you, the listener, with one final thought to mull over. If Zeihan is right, and geography is destiny again, take a hard look at your own city or region.
Yeah.
Do you have local water, local energy, local agriculture? If the global trucks stop rolling and the container ships stop sailing, what does your 100-mile radius actually look like? It's terrifying, it's fascinating, and it definitely makes you look at a map with a fresh set of eyes. Thanks for listening.
Until next time.